everyone is in the attendance mode, so you're listed as an attendee. At the end of Yulia's seminar, we'll have a Q&A, and at which point you'll be brought in on the stage and be a panelist to answer and ask questions. So thank you all for attending. I want to get started. My name is Amina Ann Kuda. Together with Mark Goldberg, I lead the research trust on augmenting human performance as part of the Matrix Consortium. It's my great pleasure to introduce today our guest speaker for the first fall seminar series for the AI Consortium, Yulia Sandamirskaya from the Applied Research Team, who leads the Applied Research Team at the Neuromorphic Computing Lab in Intel. Prior to Intel, she was at the Institute of Neuroinformatics at the University of Zurich and ETH Zurich, where she led a group on neuromorphic cognitive computing and robots, and also at the Institute of Computation, where she also led a group on autonomous learning. She's moreover coordinated the EU Networking Action Neurotech and co-chaired the European Society for Artificial Cognitive Systems. She has over 17 years of research experience in the fields of neurodynamics, embodied cognition, and autonomous robotics. I'm very excited to hear her seminar series, and I look forward to the Q&A. Yulia, please take it over.
Thank you so much, Amina. Thanks for this kind introduction, and thanks also for inviting me to this forum, even to open this fall series. Really a pleasure to be here. I don't know much about Matrix AI Consortium yet, so I didn't know exactly what kind of audience to expect. So my presentation might be a little bit high level, but I hope inspiring. And I hope we'll put a couple of pointers on the metrics of AI that you guys have in mind. Let's see, so neuromorphic computing from theory to applications of brain-inspired AI. So AI, artificial intelligence. And of course, the first question we should ask ourselves is, what is intelligence? And usually, historically, when we think about intelligence, we have in mind our human intelligence. So all the things that make us humans so smart. And one seminal examples for a long time was stuff like chess playing or solving mathematical tasks, so doing all this thinking, logical stuff that humans are so good at. And a lot of the field of artificial intelligence, especially the good old-fashioned classical AI, was about that, about trying to make computers and machines that can also solve tasks like this, play chess, do mathematical calculations, and in the end was quite successful. Now, in the recent decades, in the recent 40 years, people have realized that there's a lot of intelligence in much simpler and maybe mundane things like just moving around. And Rodney Brooks emphasized it in a seminal paper that he has read, Elephants Don't Play Chess. And if you look across the animal kingdom, there's really a lot of intelligence in how different animals move, how they perceive the environment, how they direct their movement at different objects in this environment, and how they manage to do it sometimes with really tiny brains, like the bee, for instance. There's one funny story about mollusks in the sea. It has two stages in its life. In one part of its life, it's moving around, and at that part of its life, it has a brain. And then at some point, it attaches itself to some stone and then continues to live as a coral. And then it digests its brain because doesn't need it anymore because it doesn't move. So it's like an anecdotal story, but indeed, all the neural systems out there in the world, they developed in order to move around. And if we take that into account, we might ask ourselves, so where are all those very smart robots? We have intelligent systems that can solve mathematical tasks, that can play chess and Go better than the humans do. But we are really lacking this type of embodied intelligence, intelligence that can control and generate movement out there. So recently, neural networks come to rescue. And with neural networks, we indeed address one of the most important problems in enabling embodied intelligence, the problem of perception. And we can see on a couple of recent examples of neural architectures that control robotic systems and that learn or are trained to control quite complex robotic systems. So I have three examples here, one from already a couple of years ago from OpenAI, where a robotic hand was trained to manipulate the Rubik's cubes. And what is trained there is a fairly deep neural network, trained end-to-end with many examples for a long time. And it manages to solve this quite complex motor task. Another example is from University of Zurich, the lab of Davide Scaramuza. He has now a couple examples of drone controllers, also trained end-to-end in a simulation and transferred on a real drone So in his work, he uses a bunch of neural networks. Some of them are responsible for state estimation of this drone based on visual information and proprioceptive information. And then another neural network is responsible for generating the right motor command, the right action, in order to do quite complex acrobatics on this drone. And the third example is neural network that controls movement of a robotic dog. So performing model predictive control and also learning complex behaviors. So there are quite a few successes of AI applied to embodied systems. However, there are also challenges. And one challenge with this today's flavor of AI, connectionist AI that uses neural networks, is how difficult they are to train. So all these modern networks that make a lot of news and that produce impressive behavior. This plot just shows until 2020. In 2022, you're probably all familiar with DALL-E networks and GTP 123 performing image generation and text analysis. But if you look at these networks, training them takes really long time and a lot of energy. So here it shows how much compute is needed to train these networks. And the amount of compute is rising steadily. So we need really large networks to solve complex tasks. And there are more problems with these systems or challenges that we need to overcome. First, usually in a robotic system, we not only need to solve the recognition task or the localization task, we need to solve multiple tasks at the same time. Many of these tasks are sequential, like for instance, motion planning or control. So it's not about just finding the mapping from image to the label, but it's about generating a sequence of commands or even orchestrating different behaviors, deciding what should be active next. The next problem with the systems is their adaptivity. If you have trained a very deep and powerful neural network, then it's difficult to adjust it just a little bit because something in your input distribution has changed. You trained during the daytime and now you want it to work also in the evening light. Or you want to add a new class to your system, or your robotic system changed slightly. Your mechanical designer comes up with a new actuator that is really, really cool. So you have to go back and retrain your network from scratch. And if you already spent a couple months training it, it's really not how we imagine these robotic systems should learn new tasks, and also not how biological systems learn new tasks. And the third problem is efficiency. So it does take a lot of power to run these networks. Now, to the contrast, if we look at those biological neural networks, it's quite amazing what they achieve with sometimes really tiny brains. So this example is of a little bird. I can even show a video. Little colibri bot, it solves this amazing vision-driven control task with very precise positioning in flight based on its vision. This bird has a 1 gram of brain, basically a rice corn, with a couple million neurons consuming 1 milliwatt of power. This creature can navigate in environments, can learn, can adjust to environmental perturbations on the fly. Now, if we take another bird with a slightly larger brain, then it can also navigate and learn on the fly, but it can also learn words. You can teach it to speak and can learn to manipulate objects. And then we scale just a little bit more, and we get the human brain with 100 billion neurons. It's not outside of our reach in terms of artificial neural networks. Consumes 20 to 80 watt of power and can do all kinds of amazing things. So we know that biological brains are adaptive, flexible, fast, precise, and efficient, a little bit in contrast to our today's neural networks, and can deal with real-world complexity, learn new tasks, and are really cognitive. So the question is, can we learn more from these brains, and what can we learn from them? So if we look closer, and those of you who are maybe neuroscientists by training, they will know that biological brains feature one particular have one particular feature, and namely they have a huge diversity of neuronal circuits and of type of neurons that solve different tasks. One could start with insect brains, and insect brains, they are small, but they're really intricately interconnected into circuits with different function. Here, an example of a locust, a little grasshopper, that has a neuron, a single neuron called locust giant motion detector neuron that detects looming motion in the visual field of this locust. So it's a single neuron, it has a branching tree, dendritic tree, that goes to its sensor, the visual sensor, and detects looming stimuli, and only that. So not translation, not some shifts, but if a bird is looming at this animal, wants to eat it, it will jump away. in an olfactory system, in a system that detects smells, you can also find intricate circuits that people think are responsible for learning smells very quickly and learning to represent these smells. In flies' brains, you can find the fly's head direction circuit, which literally looks like a little compass. It's a ring of neurons, and if you do some calcium imaging of these neurons, you can see that they track the activity of these neurons, tracks the head direction of this animal. So it's an intricate circuit that seems to have a function or a purpose of tracking the head direction of the animal. And we can continue, we can go all the way to mammals, like humans, and look at our cortex, and we will see that our cortex has 6 layers. Each layer has slightly different neurons that have different connectivity structure. There's quite stereotypical connectivity motif between different layers that seems to perform some kind of predictive coding computation all across the cortex, visual, auditory, or premotor cortex. Then we can go to hippocampus, and again, we will find cells that are called place cells, or sometimes time cells. We will find the substrate for episodic memory there, and we will see particular structures and network motifs that are responsible for navigation, for instance, or for your episodic memories. And then cerebellum, this small brain that is very densely populated with tiny neurons, and it seems to fine-tune our movement. Again, has a certain structure, how neurons are interconnected. Or we can look into basal ganglia that seems to orchestrate and switch on and off different parts of the brain. So these are just some little snippets on examples of neuronal circuits, neuronal structures, neuronal motifs, and principles that we know from neurobiology. And we see a huge diversity here, going far beyond feed-forward or convolutional neural networks that are used in technical applications today. The second feature that we can notice in neurobiology is that animals don't start from scratch when they are born into this world. All these brains and neural systems, they have a lot of predetermined structure, which is just augmented with learning and plasticity. And notably, this learning and plasticity never stops. It's constantly there, and it accompanies the behavior. It's not that we are born with a completely blank brain, then we sit in front of a television, look at pictures, and then we are ready to go. We are being born with a highly structured brain, and then that constantly adapts, learns, and plastically changes depending on its experience. So if we now would think of how can we now use all this diversity and implement it in our technical systems to solve some practical tasks. One thing we need to do and to think about is matching these algorithms to the hardware on which they will run. And historically, as most of you probably know, the so-called von Neumann computing architecture with a central processing unit separated from the memory is the dominating computing architecture that's behind most computers in this world, whether it's a laptop, a desktop, your watch, your smartphone, all the microcontrollers that control a lot of smart devices, maybe in your homes or cities. They use this structure. You have a central control unit, it fetches variables from the memory and then sequentially makes like elementary operations on them. Now, if we imagine we have this massively parallel neuronal system that we want to simulate on this computer, there will be a pretty big mismatch, because now the computer on every time step needs to, like for every time step of my neuronal dynamics, will need to do a lot of computation. It needs to touch every variable in that network that needs to be updated, and updated and write it back to memory. So typically the CPU will need to compute a lot in order to make computation in this massively parallel system. So a big breakthrough in AI happened when people discovered that we can use the graphical processing units that people developed in order to render pictures on our screens, that we can use them to run these neural networks. They offer us a parallel system, of course, of central processing units. They still have a large bulk of memory sitting outside of this cores, and we still have a problem that the cores need to get their variables from memory, but at least they can now work on several neuronal variables at the same time, which makes the processing much, much faster. It still burns a lot of energy because you still have this memory bottleneck, but you will be much faster. You will be much faster if the task that you're solving matches this hardware. And this hardware was developed for creating images on our screen, and it works well for processing images or data that can be represented with dense matrices of numbers. And today's neural networks, this is basically what they are. We have layers and layers of matrices. Now we start with the image and then we transform it from layer to layer, and we keep this dense matrix structure. So these GPU systems are great for accelerating this type of neural network architecture. But what about all these other beautiful architectures? Many of them don't really have this matrix structure. They don't need it. They have more intricate connectivity. They may have multiple motifs that, multiple recurrent motifs that interact with each other. So neuromorphic computing architecture is a new pillar of hardware design and architecture that seems to support this type of architectures very well. It is not surprising because neuromorphic computing was inspired by the biological substrate, by the biological brain. Originally, it was developed in a bottom-up fashion. People were fascinated by how the brain is built on its lowest structural level, and were trying to build the same thing with electronics, with an idea it will be good for something one day, and I believe this day maybe have come. So in this architecture, we again have a massively parallel system of cores, so of processing units, but now the memory is closely collocated with this cores. So the memory is put closer to processing units, so that now our neurons can have a state which is computed locally and which can be updated locally. So our neurons don't have to be just the signal transmitting devices. They can now have the dynamics of their own. And that's an important property for of these computing hardware and also of neuronal architectures, biological neuronal architectures. The connections between neurons, the weights, they are now also stored locally, close to the processing units, and they can be updated locally. So you can efficiently update your connections and by that implement continual or online learning. So your system can constantly change and reshape its connections. Typically, these architectures will use asynchronous event-based computing, which makes them even more efficient. So the system doesn't depend on a clock that dictates the processors to do some operation on every teeny tiny nanosecond. But the processors only process something if there is information to be processed. So Intel has developed one of such devices called Loihi. Loihi 1 chip is already a few years old, so it was announced in 2018. And it has the features that are shared with other neuromorphic systems. So compute memory is integrated here to specially embody program networks. The neuron usually has some temporal model because now it can have a state and it can have a dynamics that changes the state over time. So the time can now be encoded in the dynamics of neurons and be processed in time. They use spike-based, event-based communication between neurons that makes computation more efficient. They support sparse connectivity. So they work best if our network has some sparse connections, when we have some intricate circuits within the networks instead of dense layered connection. It supports on-chip learning, so all our weights, connections between neurons can be plastic, can change on the fly. And the Intel's system uses digital asynchronous implementation. Now, you might know from your colleagues that there are of course many more neuromorphic chips out there. Like almost every big computer company like IBM and Qualcomm had their neuromorphic devices. The Human Brain Project, a large European project, has brought 2 such devices, Spinnaker platform and Spinnaker 2, and Brain Scales. And then there's a whole zoo of startups that build different types of this technology. Some of them use digital electronics to still kind of leverage today's digital technology, but optimize it for this type of networks and this type of computing. Asynchronous, massively parallel with localized memory and with ability to adapt and to dynamically compute in this network. Other people use mixed signal analog digital circuits that of course make implementation of individual elements much more energy efficient, because you can just use a handful of transistors in order to implement the temporal neuronal dynamics. Some build large-scale systems, some explore new technology and new materials to even more efficiently implement individual elements of these systems. And many of you might be familiar with sensors, vision sensors that also follow the same event-based philosophy. We at Intel find it very important. We like, you know, our success depends on our ability to benchmark this system and to show where it has its advantages, where it's really advantageous to use it. So in our 2021 IEEE proceedings paper, we have summarized results of our group and also our colleagues and partners from Intel's neuromorphic research community that have compared performance of different workloads on Loihi versus other hardware systems, CPU, GPU, Movidius, or TrueNorth accelerators. So every dot is some workload where a comparison or benchmark has been run. And we can see, so here's the parity line here where, you know, it's the same, the performance is the same. The performance is measured in terms of energy ratio, so how many times was Loihi better than other systems, and solution time ratio, so how much faster was Loihi. And you can see that the scale goes to 100,000 times better energy and 1,000 times faster, but not all networks land there. So if we see around the parity line, we will see these networks, which are usually some kind of deep feed-forward networks. So those don't seem to be supported very well by chips like Loihi. One can see why that is so, because these networks, they are designed to process images. Images are dense matrices of numbers. And from layer to layer of the network, we want to keep this, you know, dense computation with numbers that we need to resolve in a pretty fine-grained way. And because the neurons in these devices are spiking, so they communicate with binary events, it becomes quite inefficient to make this computation in a really deep neural networks. However, we have many networks in this corner, and all of these networks are some kind of recurrent networks that can be expressed as a recurrent graph. And we can see, you know, SLAM, simultaneous localization and mapping networks there, controllers, adaptive controllers, all kind of parallel search networks, either graph search or k-nearest neighbor search algorithms, or constraint satisfaction problem solvers. So this study was performed with our old chip, Loihi 1. Intel has recently released the second generation of neuromorphic chip based on these results. So we have seen that Loihi 1 didn't work very well for deep networks, but many people want to implement deep networks on these chips. So what do we do? So we have changed a couple of design decisions in order to enable more efficient implementation of deep networks. So what Loihi 2 offers is a programmable neuron. So the neuronal model in a typical neuromorphic architecture will be leaky, integrate, and fire neuron, one specific neuronal model. On Loihi 2, the neuronal model can be programmed more or less freely. So one can integrate exotic types of neurons like resonate and fire neuron or sigma delta modulating neuron. We have generalized the notion of spike. So typical spike in the neuromorphic system is a binary event. It's either there or not. And this is what makes this deep network so inefficient. So in Loihi 2, we can send a number with a spike. So it doesn't have to be a binary event. We have enhanced learning, enabled 3-factor learning rules. So remember, all those weights and synapses in the network can change on the fly. And as a user, I can design a rule according to which the synapses should change. And this gives me more freedom how to design the rule. And then, of course, because of their more advanced technology, it is much faster, it can support more neurons, and has better scaling and integration than the previous system. These are the two systems that we currently offer our partners to work with. One is a single chip system for early evaluation, and the second one is Kapoho Point. It's a 4 × 4 inches stackable 8-chip system. I got to see and to hold it in my hand during this year's Telluride workshop. It's a really elegant card. I was really very proud of our systems integration team. So no, these chips in the end is just very expensive sand, as our system developer guy said, right? So they're just the hardware systems. The big question is how to program them. Remember that what the architecture of these chips is very different from our conventional computer, and all the software that we have is in the end designed for conventional computing architecture, and all the algorithms that are analyzed and understood, they assume the sequential von Neumann processing architecture. So it is important to develop a software framework and also algorithmic framework that allows us to efficiently develop algorithms and programs for this type of hardware. So we at Intel started this open source software effort called Lava. It's a software framework which supports asynchronous event-based processing. Is supposed to map to heterogeneous hardware platforms, so not only support Loihi platforms, but also other neuromorphic platforms, or CPU, or GPU, or FPGA. Has architecture-specific modeling abstractions. So at some layer, we will have an abstraction of capabilities only Loihi offers, and someone else could design this abstraction layer for Spinnaker platform or other neuromorphic platforms. Flexible cross-platform execution, offline training of neuromorphic networks. It's supposed to be modular and extensible. Offers Python interfaces for simplicity of development, offers integration with third-party frameworks such as ROS, Robotic Operating System, and we hope to make it open source, and we really hope that the community will help develop this framework for benefit of the whole neuromorphic research community. So all this in the picture. So the idea of Lava is that it supports a runtime that is specific for different platforms. And in case of Loihi, it probably will stay proprietary because it reveals some details of hardware implementation. Then it has a compiler that takes a high-level description of the network and then puts it on the actual hardware in some more or less optimal way. Then the core is the communicating sequential process API. So this is what builds the core of the Lava framework. So everything is a process in this framework. A neuron is a process because it has some internal variable and has some rule according to which this internal variable can change, has some inputs and some outputs. I can build a group of neurons and define them as a process. And then I can hierarchically build the whole system of such processes. And then we will, we develop now several libraries that support different kind of programming frameworks, one could say, and I say a bit more about those that can be implemented in Lava and can eventually be compiled and run either on Loihi or on the CPU and be compared. And we hope that also to develop interfaces to other systems that people know and love, like Brian or Brian 2 or TensorFlow, Mango, and so on. Okay, so I will maybe skip quickly. So this is a conceptual description of what Lava is. So as I said, everything is a neuronal process. So we can have some processes that are just conventional threads running in C++ on your CPU. Maybe it grabs data from some sensor. Another process can be a neuronal process. So these are some neurons that maybe run on some neuromorphic hardware. We can have connection processes there, and we can form some network, let's say with multiple layers or with multiple populations of neurons. And we can also have a process that will run something like backpropagation, training this network. And then at the end, all these processes will communicate with messages. So that's the vision for Lava. Today we are working on 4 libraries, so 4 different flavors of type of neuronal architectures that we think Loihi and similar hardware systems will support well. One of them, very important one, is optimization. So it's tools that allow us to develop different optimization solvers. Constraint satisfaction problem is maybe the simplest one, but then also the quadratic optimization problems, lasso, so sparse coding problems. And in this library, we will have modules that allow us to define optimization problem. So the variables and the constraints between these variables, and then it will be compiled, will be put into Loihi hardware, will be iterated, and the solutions will be presented to the user in different forms for different these optimization methods. The second framework is the neuronal attractor network. So this is one that I bring from my previous academic experience. So we believe that in particular for robotic systems and for cognitive robotic systems, it is important that our neuronal populations can create stable attractor states, because only such stable state can persist long enough in order to have impact on our motor system and then eventually change something in the environment. And the simple example of that is a winner-take-all architecture. And there are different types of this continuous attractor networks with dynamic neural fields, which can form modules out of which we can build cognitive architectures. Deep learning is, of course, part of this framework, because deep learning is a really powerful tool for many practical applications today. And one can either do conversion from conventional deep neural network to spiking neural network with rate-coded neurons, or one can directly train a spiking neural network, convolutional spiking neural network, using different neuronal models. The one that we now try to promote and use and recommend is the sigma delta neural networks, where each neuron kind of transmits a message when the change in its input has passed some threshold. So it computes the delta, and if the delta passes some threshold, then this delta is transmitted from layer to layer. Meaning, if you with this network, if you process a video stream, and if some pixels you don't have any change, then your network won't transmit the information from the pixels where no change has happened, and that can make your network much more efficient. And the final are vector symbolic architecture. So this is a relatively exotic computational framework that postulates that any symbol or any variable important for a task can be encoded in high-dimensional vectors, high-dimensional random vectors, and then you can use some nice mathematical properties of these high-dimensional random vectors in order to do computation in these symbolic space. So we're now building abstraction tools that help us use these vector symbolic architectures. Right, and then so we hope to add model learning for the optimization problems. There's associative learning working in neural attractor networks, gradient-based learning for deep learning, and high-dimensional vector learning, which is a type of associative learning for vector symbolic architectures. So to summarize, so how can we learn from biology to program these networks? I think overall as a community, so we hope that by collecting a library of different solutions, answering the questions of why this solution is there, understanding what kind of task this solution is solving, what kind of constraints are present in this task, which goals this certain algorithm pursues. Then the solution expressed as an algorithm, and then each algorithm can be expressed with different mechanisms. So by collecting a whole library of such different solutions, we might be able to understand some computing principles and fundamental building blocks for a computing paradigm. So if we have realized that for this computing hardware, we have to build computing paradigm, more or less from scratch, this is the exercise that we need to continue doing iteratively in order to build this computing framework. And this could be inspiring. It could be inspiring for new hardware solutions, new algorithms and computational frameworks, and also better understanding of biological systems by trying to understand, to go through all these Mars layers of computation and trying to understand what computation these different biological brains and systems are doing. So now if we look at different examples of algorithms that have been used so far for neuromorphic hardware, I have a little list. And the first thing, I just have to mention the training feed-forward deep neural networks, because this is, of course, the first thing that people do when they hear something neural network, supporting neural network. And it also shows some successes, and there are also clear metrics that allow us to compare results on neuromorphic hardware with other systems, clear data sets, benchmarks, set state-of-the-art levels. So here's one example of training feed-forward deep neural network, training it with in the spiking domain, or maybe even training in the non-spiking domain and transferring it in the spiking domain. And this network is trained to recognize gestures from event-based gesture dataset. And then the new part in this particular work is that the readout of this network is made plastic on chip, so that the system can learn new gestures on the fly based on the feature representation that was trained on the previous data set. And these kind of type of implementation can be successful. So with Loihi 1, it has been shown by our colleagues that if we have a deep neural network and we convert it in a spiky neural network and run it on a neuromorphic chip, then we can have some gain, definitely in dynamic energy cost per inference, also in inference speed. As the network gets larger, the inference speed doesn't go down as quickly as with other systems. And also the energy cost per inference also stays constant as the network grows. On Loihi 2, so my colleagues have shown recently that one can be even more efficient because of these new innovations, the graded spike, the concept of graded spike, and the possibility to adjust the neuronal model, so to use the sigma delta neuron. We can use smaller, we have more efficient use of neuronal cores on the chip, so 5 times smaller network. We are 6 times faster than on Loihi 1, and also consume 6 times less energy. And this is with leak integrate and fire spiky neural network. If we use sigma delta neural network, then we can be even more efficient and even faster. So this is the deep neural network trained outside. Another thing that one can do is train spiky neural network directly. This is what has been done here. And then Slayer is a learning method that can be used to train spiky neural network directly. Here, this network has been trained for recognizing event-based data set from IBM. And one can show that this will be energy efficient and fast. One can also implement networks that allow us to do one-shot learning of patterns. And it has been shown for olfaction-inspired pattern learning for memorizing smells. I've already shown this circuit once. So what happens here is that we store a pattern as a vector of delays. So where each value in the vector is stored in a delay of a weight. And we memorize this pattern and these delays, and this pattern can be recognized in a mixture of flavors. And one can show here that after one presentation, one can already recognize the smell, which would require 3,000 presentations of the smell in different mixtures if we would just have a deep network that would recognize that. Now, if we go to more exotic architectures that still do pattern recognition, so I could highlight this, our recent work that was highlighted at ICANN's conference, Continual Learning for Robots. So here what we have built, we have a visual processing task. We want this robotic agent, here a simulated one, to learn to recognize objects. But we wanted to learn in an interactive session with the user. So the user will present different objects and will name these objects, and the robot will learn them. Then the robot will try to recognize the object. If it doesn't recognize the object, we wanted to ask for a label. We want to it to actively kind of trigger or request a label if needed. So we want to have interactive, active, autonomous learning scenario. So how we have done this? So we had a relatively simple example. So we've asked this robot to learn just a handful of objects, just maybe 10 objects in this case. And the task is, of course, different here than the classical image classification task. We don't want this robot to recognize any cat on this planet as a cat, even the ones that look really in an exotic way. We wanted to learn these particular 10 objects that happen to be in the environment of this robot today. So we start with designing a feature extraction layer, which can be simple. That in this case was very simple, sequence of Gabor convolutional layers. But you can use your favorite feature extraction layer. It can be pre-trained on your favorite data set. Now the core of the system builds this last bit, which on one hand side has a number of plastic synapses on chip that can be updated on the fly. And then it features a neuronal state machine. So neuronal state machine is a collection of neurons that get activated and deactivated in different states. And they detect different states of the systems. For instance, one state could be there is an input present, but no output, meaning there's an object which I don't recognize. And this kind of the state will then trigger the robot to ask for a label. When the label is presented, there's a neuron that represents different labels. The labels are just extracted from text recognition system, off-the-shelf one. And then the system will detect whether this is a new label or a previously heard label. If it's a new label, then a new group of neurons will be recruited that will represent this new object and that will learn this new object. So the weights that go into the feature space will be updated to store the representation of this new object. If the label has been heard before, it means, I have seen this object before, I probably have learned it, so I need to update representation for that particular object. So I will change my representation of that object without touching the other ones. So that helps me to alleviate the problem of catastrophic forgetting to some extent, because the update is always localized to the object in question. So either to the object for which the label was provided or to the object for which I have made a mistake. So if I recognize an object, I say the the name of the object that I have recognized, but the label, the user said, no, 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 that's not a ball, that's a cup. I will have an error neuron that also triggers a learning process, both in the object that I have falsely recognized and the object that I have falsely not recognized. And the weights will be changed accordingly. So they will be weakened or strengthened, depending on whether I want to, strengthen the representation of currently perceived object or weaken it. Another kind of novelty of the system is that each object is represented by a group of neurons, and these neurons are recruited if a particular object has very different views. So if my object is a round ball, then I probably can represent it with a single output neuron and with one set of weights, some round thing. If my object looks very differently from different sides, for instance, then I might want to have several neurons with their sets of weights to represent different sides of this object. In some extreme case, I could have like a whole 360 degrees kind of sampling of the object represented by a separate set of weights. So now we have designed this architecture, we have put it on the EHE1 chip, have run some comparisons with state-of-the-art continual learning classifiers, have shown that we can achieve decent accuracy compared to the state-of-the-art. We're a little bit faster, especially during learning, than other systems, and then we consume much less energy. And the interesting thing to note here is that energy consumption is exactly the same for inference and learning, because there's almost no difference between an inference instance and a learning instance. Just know whether a couple synapses get updated or not, but the rest of the network, all the activation, all the spikes are exactly the same. So that was a nice piece of work. Now, this whole architecture, you can see it here, is only part of the story, of course, part of the task that this robotic agent needs to accomplish. So in our overall scenario, the robot will face at some tabletop with a bunch of objects on it. It will direct its gaze on one object at a time. We'll try to recognize this object. So this is when this module will be engaged. If the object is recognized, its position will be stored in some kind of spatial memory, so that I even if I don't look at the object, I can remember that my cup was to the left, to the right, in different spatial locations. Then we have another module that generates kind of attention, that highlights all the objects that are present in front of me without setting a label. So I just know there's an object here, there, and there. And then if I look at them and recognize them with my object recognition network, then I can attach a label to that particular object and store it spatially. And then I have these little neuronal circuits, again, neuronal state machine that just orchestrates these different behaviors. Look at the object, try to recognize it. If you don't recognize it, then learn it. If you recognize it, store it in a memory. So it's an architecture that is very heterogeneous in terms of type of networks that are there. There's a little deep feed-forward convolutional network. There's different types of state machines. There are some synapses that are plastic. This whole spatial memory network is again a network inspired by hippocampal and entorhinal cortex networks that stores spatial positions. And I could have probably another lecture about that network. So there are some snippets of that, right? So it starts with some kind of place cells that represent so in this case, just the two-dimensional coordinates on the table. Then we have kind of some kind of system that represents shifts in this space. We can also have some system that represents relative positions of different objects. Something is to the left of something else, or to the right, or above. And then it has an error monitoring and correction. So important part of this localization and mapping networks is that if I expect something to be in a certain location and it is not there, then an error will be generated and I will update my memory. Yeah, so this is just a couple examples. More examples are now in the development, especially for Loihi 2. Some of them are about efficient signal processing, whether it's in audio, in video, or in tactile sensing. And others are in optimization problem solving. So this is one large domain where we have different applications and see a lot of successes of this framework. So to conclude, this idea of logic, reasoning, and symbol processing, it is still important. We still need to do that. But in modern systems, and especially if we think about those future robotic systems, we need to do that while also doing sensor processing and movement generation. So the two kind of worlds of embodied cognition and good old-fashioned AI need to be brought together. And they can be brought together over the concept of representation, like those spatial representations, but also recognizing things, the what and where pathways. Decision making needs to be part of the story, and also action generation needs to be part of the story. We think that in order to achieve that, we need to build intelligent neuronal architectures. So we still need to do a lot of architecture search, so designing different topologies of networks, not just feedforward, not just convolutional, and not just recurrent with random recurrent connections, but really thinking about the structures that could solve a particular task. And we can draw inspiration from biology for those. So there are many circuits that neurobiologists have discovered, or we can be driven just by mathematical algorithms that discover some geometry of some tasks or dynamics of some tasks, and then just express them in these neuronal terms. And then hopefully this will enable smart autonomous systems that are urgently required in many domains of our life and work. And it definitely needs to be a community effort. So, at Intel, we are Intel Labs, so we're a small research lab. And there are many groups that work in this neuromorphic computing and neuromorphic hardware. And we really hope that we will manage to kind of unite and define our shared goals and develop shared tools and infrastructure that will allow us to move forward and bring orders of magnitude gains to new intelligent computing applications, change the face of computing, and we're also hoping to expand the community. Yeah, thank you very much. I think I've left a couple minutes at least for questions. I will be happy to answer all of them.
Thank you, Yulia. That was a very elegant overview of your work in neuromorphic computing. Appreciate you giving this first seminar. We want to open it up for people who have questions from everyone who's now made a panelist. Please go ahead and any questions, raise your hand or just start talking. Thank you again, Yulia. Well, I guess I can get started. One of the questions I have is, you have at your fingertips many different analogies to the brain and different types of organisms at scale. Are you learning in building the software and the hardware? Are you learning something vice versa? You're learning something about the biology in the process?
Definitely. I think especially this exercise of embodied implementation. So when we try to put our neuronal models into a behaving system, into a robotic system, then we discover things like, perception needs time, or, different sensory modalities might have different time scales. Especially action and movement generation requires time. So a very concrete example. So I was working on sequence generation in my PhD. And if you have a neuronal model for sequence generation, you create a population that represents item A, B, C, and then you create the sequence and they go A, B, C. Now, if this A, B, C are actually some actions, even if it's blinking, but even if it's some other action, it takes time to generate them. So your neuronal circuit cannot just go A, B, and then C, because A has not been executed yet. So that kind of triggered my whole thinking. So how are sequences represented in such a way that they can be acted out by some physical system? This is just one example, but there are more. So I think this building, even simulating system, already brings some insight and discovers some gaps in our thinking. But bringing them in robotic systems, in an embodied system, that brings a lot of insight that we might overlook if we just theoretically come up with some models, neuronal function.
Yeah. I see, Ty, you have a question.
Yeah. Hey, first I want to say thanks for the very interesting and detailed presentation. I'll just be real quick with the question. So when it comes to deploying tasks for like embodied agents, it requires a simulator because you can't really train everything online, with the real robot. And so I wanted to know, are y'all using any sort of existing, simulation platform, or did y'all have to come up with a customary or proprietary solution for that?
So for us, we used a relatively simple off-the-shelf solution. We use Gazebo Simulator.
Mm-hmm.
Our partners had the robotic system, the ICAP robot model already there. We used event-based camera simulator, eSIM, from David Escaramuza's lab. So we wanted to simulate the sensor as well. And then we used the objects. There are 3D renderings of objects. It's called ICAP World Dataset. So this ICAP group in Genoa, they have some object, a set of 100 objects, which they have physically, and they have 3D models of those, so that you can really render, these objects in their 3D entirety. And it was pretty simple kind of setup. We have colleagues, for instance, at ETH, they've developed their own simulation framework where they partially use the models for their robots that are neural networks themselves, trained with a robot in the loop. And in that lab, they actually use several simulation platforms at the same time and compare them. And depending on the task, they might use one or the other. If you want to run reinforcement learning simulations, you might need a different simulator than if you want to run some, physics simulations, because
Right.
you want to train. And then if vision is important, then you also might want to use other simulators that have nicer rendering. And then if
Right.
vision is not important. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Sergio, you have a question? Or Yulia? Sergio, you have a question? We can't hear your audio at the moment.
Now, okay, now you can hear me, right? Just
Yes.
to ask a question, can this be used to learn to using in a robot to learn how to use its motors and identify how to move its arms or its legs?
I probably missed the beginning of the question. So do you ask if we have done that?
Yeah, if you have done it, or is it, or if it is possible to do it?
Everything is possible, right? The question is whether it's needed. So if the motor is slightly different than the muscle, right? The muscle, I really don't know. If I send my command 3 spikes per second, I really don't know a priori what will happen to my arm, right? So there I really need to learn the mapping from my signal, and it's really some motor neuron will send 3 spikes per second. So I need to see how far it gets my muscle, and I need to learn this mapping. When I buy a motor and it's a DC motor from the shelf, I know that if I send certain command where it will land. If I don't, I might want to calibrate it. Whether I want to make this part of the kind of my system depends on what my overall task is. I might want just to rely on calibration of this motor and focus on my visual task, for instance. Or I might want to make it part of the system. For instance, what we have done at some point is we've learned that the system, it was learning to look and then learning to reach. So I would learn the mapping from position in the camera and the kind of the motor command that I need to send to my camera in order to put this position in the center of visual field to saccadic eye movement. I don't know this command a priori because geometry of my camera might have some aberrations and my motor system might have some weird joints right in this head. So I can learn this command. And then I can learn to reach by learning like the command that will bring my end effector to some position XYZ, and then again aligning it with my visual, with the visual XY, because these are XYZs are different. However, in that task, I will learn the motor command in terms of the task space, the end effector position, and not the joint position. Learning like the joint positions that will bring my end effector somewhere is a more complex task. We'll have like 8 degrees of freedom, 8-dimensional space to explore. So in any case, if I would want to do that, I will make sure that I have a hierarchy of tasks. So first I maybe learn how to move my arm, and how to bring my end effector into different XYZ. And then I assume, okay, that's done. And then I learn how to align this XYZ with visually perceived XY. And then maybe I have some more sophisticated task where I detect objects and localize them in 3D to determine their position in the camera image. Because if I would want to learn everything from scratch, that might just take too long. So it's good to, and then this is what happens in humans and animal learning as well, shaping, right? That when we want to teach some complex task, we need to shape it. We need to simplify things and then focus on one element of the task and then make it more complex slowly. Yeah, with kids, it happens naturally because they're so clumsy, and so weak in the beginning. They can only lie there and like look around with their eyes. At some point, they can move their head. Okay, the task is more complex. And then they sit down, the whole new world. Then they start moving their arms. So it's important to have a right curriculum for your learning task. Yeah, so I hope that somewhat answers the question. Yeah, so learning is possible. It's not easy, I think, in motor space because motor spaces have so many degrees of freedom, large space to explore.
Yeah.
You have a question from Alec? Alec?
Hi, great talk. So I guess you mentioned there was a lot of interest in running like standard dense models on these kinds of new silicon, and you mentioned converting ANNs to spiky neural networks using like rate encoding, for example. I was wondering, I think long term, we will definitely probably move to something like SSNs where you can really efficiently leverage the hardware. But in the short term, how do you see that kind of approach of taking a dense network and trying to turn it into an SSN, SNN, comparing to something like quantization or using XNOR networks in terms of performance, like accuracy, and in terms of efficiency of the compute?
It always depends, right? So there are examples in one or the other way. So I personally believe that so these spiky neural networks are not made for processing video. And if we go to these analog networks, maybe even less, video, is processing matrices of numbers, and this is definitely not something our brains evolved to process. Now, if you look at our retina, right, it's evolved to process these temporally changing signals, trying to reduce dimensionality as soon as possible, right, and not just have these matrices. With tricks, one can make it efficient, like for instance, the sigma delta encoding, having graded spikes, help us to be more efficient. Maybe if this recognition task is part of a larger system where we also do either optimization or maybe control, it might be even advantageous to have it all in the same paradigm, and then will win additional advantages that you don't have to switch between paradigms, right? So first you have this recognition, classification, or segmentation task, and then on top of that you have some controller running or optimization running. But otherwise, so these other devices like visual processing units, the TPUs, they were designed and optimized to process this type of task, and then you can optimize them further by sparsification, low resolution of numbers, and it's great, right? If what you want to do is segment images, then you should use the hardware that's made for that. I think that's fine. We might still want to do a good job on these tasks because we might want to have it as part of a larger system. Yeah, but we also do other things. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
And you have two more questions. One is from Jeremy. If we have enough time, there's one more.
Sure.
Sure. My question is more towards the role of development. What kind of techniques do you use to explain the explainable AI in the neural networks? Sometimes you might give a response that is expected, but the reasoning behind it, how do you understand the reasoning behind it? So if you put in the same situation, it doesn't do something completely different.
So that's a great question, right? I think it's a big trouble of this today's flavor of AI, all these connectionist networks. When I have a deep network, I have trained it, and it gives me an answer, and I really don't know how it came up with this answer. And so how we contribute to developing the approach to counteracting that is that our networks are usually not very deep, because being deep is not obligatory very advantages of these networks. They are shallow and they are rather modular. So I would try to kind of single out a subtask, even of my visual processing task, and then have some shallow network for that subtask. And then I have for other subtasks, I have other networks. So if an error happens, I can assign this error to a particular module, and I will know, okay, my color perception is off, or my contour segmentation is off, or my tracking is off, or my detection is off. So by making this more modular network with larger modules, that helps me to have a bit more explainability in the system.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we have that in mind. It's an important task, I think, especially for real world applications.
Thank you, Yulia. You have one last question from Truman.
Hey, is there some kind of heuristic for understanding the current scale of Loihi 2 in terms of like the potential for long range connections and also just the number of connections per neuron?
So I think the heuristic is, so it has 8 times more neurons than on Loihi 1, meaning per core we can implement up to 8,000 leaky integrated fire neurons. Now you can have more complex neuronal models now, right? So you could have a neuron that has like 3 internal variables, and the size of like how many neurons you have is limited by the memory that you have, right? So your neurons will have some state and it needs to be stored in memory. So for leaky integrated fires, it will be 8,000 per core. We have 128 cores, so we have around 1 million neurons on chip. The same story with connections. you can have fewer connections, fewer neurons per core, and then you have more memory for connections. This is one change in Loihi 2. The memory between neurons, neuronal states and connection states is flexible. So you can have fewer neurons, more connections, simpler neurons, more connections. But the ratio is approximately the same, I think. Well, like, coarsely speaking, maybe 4,000 connections per neuron. If you have, these 8,000 neurons per core. If you have fewer neurons per core, then you can have more connections per neuron. So that's the trade-off. Short-term versus long-term connection might bring you a little more overhead, right? Because the spikes need to jump over more routers. But otherwise, there's no limitation, right? So because addressing is done kind of digitally, you can connect like neuron on one side of the chip to neuron on the other side of the chip. In your software program, you probably won't even know, like without doing some magic, where your neurons will end on the chip, right? So you have your network, and then the compiler will decide where to put those neurons with its compilers, cost functions in mind, try to make your network efficient and fast. Yeah, so it will today will take care for you where your neurons end. Maybe they end close to each other, maybe they will end far away from each other. On our chip, it wouldn't matter that much. Yeah, so I hope all these questions can be answered. So if you join INRC, you can get like documentation that gives you like a lot of characteristics and specs from the chip, with the size of those memory banks, for instance.
Thank you so much, Yulia. We're out of time. I really appreciate you coming and giving an excellent seminar for our first AI Matrix seminar series this fall. And thank the audience for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for good questions.
Thank you. Thank you.